Um, you should kind of be finishing up modules 1 and 2 and jumping into 3 and 4. So that's getting into your resumes and cover letters, where to look for things. And if you are following along in the assignments, then that would mean that you're submitting a draft resume soon and a draft cover letter, and I'll take a look at those. If you have an old something, and I just really ask that you watch the modules first, even if it's on 2x speed, make the suggestions that I suggest in the video and then send it to me if you can. And that way I'm not repeating the same thing to all 18 of you. And in the last group sessions, they were really great. We talked about internships, paid versus unpaid, where to find entry-level jobs, and we talked about organization, and we talked about workplace trauma, which some of you have experienced but had never really heard of or thought of in the way that we discussed it. And if you guys have anything that you want to discuss and can't make those group meetings or something, feel free to sign up for one-on-ones. We did decide that the last week in the cohort will be in person, and that way we can continue to try to have in-person mock interviews. So
last 2 weeks. Last 2 weeks. Week 23 is Laura's a week, and then we have week 24, which is the capstone wrap-up week.
Thanks. Yeah, so it'll be the last 2 weeks. So you might as well just settle into that and plan for it. And the in-person with the career stuff is just a lot more helpful to be able to have conversations and do the work together than it is doing it hybrid or virtually. So all efforts to make it there in person, and then we can have mock interviewers come in and meet with you and do some interviews. In the meantime, we do have some internal processes for that. We'll at the next group meetings, which is the 28th and 29th, we'll start diving into that. We'll do some group questions together, and then we'll talk more about where to get more experience doing those mock interviews and getting practice doing that, because you really want to get over those first time jitters during this program, not afterwards. You may blow an opportunity that you really want because you haven't gotten past that initial how does this work question before doing it here. So that's pretty much all I had. If anyone has any burning questions that you'd like to ask right now, I can do that, but I'm really just here for a quick pop in and remind you that there is the career side of things and that I'm over here to help.
Any questions for Laura?
Okay, awesome. Well, you're welcome to message me anytime or schedule.
I actually had a question. I was trying to understand how the action plan worked, because I looked at the draft that it was in the module, but I didn't understand how. But that's also because I didn't start looking at module 3. If it's covered in module 3 and 4, then you don't have to answer it. But I
Okay.
was confused with the action plan.
Thanks, Wani. That's a good question. It is covered, but I will say that's still a good point. The one assignment that you are required to finish to check off careers and code is the action plan. So that is so that when you leave here, we know that you have a plan for yourself to continue networking, applying, finishing your resume if you hadn't finished it. So anything that you weren't done, it's on your action plan to get done, and that you have some sort of roadmap for leaving here, because after you leave, you're still continuing to learn things, but then you also need to be looking for opportunities. So that is the one required assignment. But yes, it is covered in those modules. So if you don't get the answers or you want to ask me separately, feel free. Thanks. All right, Max, back to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for stopping by.
Good night, everybody.
All right. Tonight we are diving into the movie project, which is definitely our most ambitious project to date. This is what we will be over the course of 3 days, right? So it starts out looking pretty easy. We got just a little text at the top. We got a little drop down. When you click on any one of those movies, you'll notice they all have different prices. So if I click on that movie, these seats are randomly generated when the page first loads. Half of them are filled, half of them are not. If you click on 2 seats that are available, it keeps track of how many seats are selected, what the total price is based off of the price of that movie. We can hit the checkout button, and it will turn those seats to red. And then the data is semi-persistent here in that if you go to another movie and then come back to Citizen Kane, you'll notice the seats that we selected are staying red. So this, believe it or not, is going to take 3 full days to build. We are going to go, not super slow on this, but we want to keep in mind here that the goal of this is not just, hey, I can write the code that Max just wrote. It is, do I understand why we are writing the code this way? Is there some terminology that he keeps saying that I don't remember the definition and need a refresher for? Do I remember what the objective here is, right? Because the goal here is not only just to learn the JavaScript side of things, the goal here is to say, hey, if I have a project like this in the future, can I engineer it down into small enough steps that I can achieve that goal, right? And so whenever we're working on a little objective here, we want to keep that in the back of our head at all times, right? Because we're going to get stuck at some point, and then we're going to be like, wait, what was I doing? He's on to the next line, and you're going to panic, right? So we always want to have it in English first. What is the one sentence that we are trying to accomplish here? Because over the course of this project, we're writing an essay, right? But you can't write the essay unless you know what the point of the paragraph is, and you can't write the paragraph unless you know, hey, what am I trying to say in this sentence, right? So that's how we want to break it down. I also don't want you to hesitate to interrupt me, whether it's your code not working, whether it's needing a concept repeated, whether it's needing a couple more minutes to work on it, whether it's saying, I think I got it, to say that exact same thing over again, right? We do these classes live for a reason, right? You guys have that feedback opportunity. Whether you or whether you're providing that feedback in the chat and you're just like, you can DM me so the whole class doesn't see it, whether it is your code isn't working and you need to share your screen, whatever it is, this is a huge, huge project, right? So I want you guys to have that live feedback. I want to make sure that I can see all of your lovely faces, and see where you guys are at on it. Now, with that said, as with all of these projects, while I encourage you to code along, it is not a requirement. So if you want to go through this the first time and just take notes as we're going and have it all sink in, and then give it a try this weekend, right? Or after class or in the morning, or whenever you do it, right? It is important to get that practice. But if you are realizing that you are someone who learns better from letting it all soak in the first time and then trying to do it on your own, that is also totally fine. But I want that level of engagement no matter what, right? And it's not just voting in the poll and going, yeah, this is all working for me. It's making sure, hey, I'm going to take breathers here. I'm going to make sure that this is all soaking in, because we not only have 3 hours tonight of this, minus our break, we don't want you to hit a saturation point an hour or two into this project and then have hours and hours of more content just not soaking in, right? And so those questions, you got to get over the fear of, I'm going to look dumb, because someone else is going to have that same exact question, and you're helping them out. And for the debugging, that's also very helpful, because chances are someone else is going to make that same mistake that you did. And we are all learning together when there's debugging, right? Of, hey, let's go through the process. Let's see how Max finds that problem. Let's see how he solves it. Let's make sure we identify what the problem is after we solve it, because all of that is going to be important, right? It took me probably 4 or 5 hours to build this project the first time, just by myself, not teaching through it. It will take double that for us to build it going through at the pace, allowing you guys to follow along, making sure it's all soaking in. Now that I've built this project, I could probably build it in 2 hours. I didn't have to do explanations or comments or anything like that. So this is not a matter of let's just blast through this project. It's a matter of you guys have to step up and do your jobs as students so I can do my job as a teacher and making sure all of this content is soaking in. So really, really want to encourage you to participate as much as possible in class tonight. I promise none of you, I will not think any of you are dumb. I promise you tonight will not impact your stipend distributions or anything like that, right? This is about you guys learning. And I can't be an effective teacher unless I get that feedback, whether it's on the 30-second feedback form at the end of class. But sometimes that's too late, right? That feedback form will only make tomorrow's class better. So jump in, come off mute, use the chat, communicate with me, right? Because this is a big, big project. With all of that said, I'm going to take a breather. Let's do stand up. How are we feeling about what we learned last week? What are concepts that clicked? What are concepts we had a light bulb moment over? What are some techniques or concepts that we know we need more practice on? How are we feeling about JavaScript 2 weeks into it?
Well, I feel like I need a little bit more practice, but with like the inner HTML, like I understand like it now, like when we have our one-on-one, like it like the light bulb moment where like the inner HTML pretty much takes the data from the HTML and put it into JavaScript. And if you want to like, and then you can mess around with it, and then if you want to push it back, it'll just like do that. So that's a light bulb moment for me with when it comes to JavaScript, and that's something I need a little bit more practice. I'm still not on that level of understanding yet, but I'm definitely understanding like the concept a little bit, just not too much.
Yep. That JavaScript rarely exists in a vacuum, right? The JavaScript isn't anything that we can actually see, right? Like it's just code that's running in the background. So how do we make it so we can see it? How do we see the output of that JavaScript? Well, of course, we can go look in the console, but the HTML is really where the JavaScript is able to make it helpful for the user, right? The end user is never going to open the console and see some output there. We need to interact and show the user what our JavaScript is doing. And that's what we use the inner HTML and the DOM document object model as a whole. The document object model is the bridge between our JavaScript is doing something and our HTML is showing something to the user. And so that document object model with things like get element by ID and inner HTML and on add event listener or on click or anything like that, right? We're working and interfacing our JavaScript directly with our HTML and sometimes our HTML directly with our JavaScript. So in order to be able to show all of that, that inner HTML is what one of the document object model properties we are using to update that HTML for the user. And we are going to get a whole heck of a lot more practice with the document object model in this project and pretty much every project from here on out. Up until React, and then we learn a more efficient way of integrating our JavaScript data into our HTML and interface generation. But for now, we got a couple more weeks of doing it the old school or old fashioned way before we get into React. Other comments from last week or how we're feeling right now in the moment?
I just got back from a 4-day camping trip, so excuse my brain lag here. Um, the uh the concepts are familiar enough to me where like I've touched on them in high school before. I think it's just about like drilling it into my brain, just the repetition of stuff. Like I understand everything. It's just remembering how to apply all of it.
Absolutely. Yep. And we got what, 3 more weeks of JavaScript from that. Which is all projects. Yeah, we're on week 8. We go all the way up until week 10. And then JavaScript does not just disappear, right? Like HTML didn't just disappear. When we get into APIs, we'll be using JavaScript for that. And then as we get into React uses a syntax called JSX, which is like if HTML and JavaScript had a baby. It's a very hybrid approach. And then when we get into full stack Node and the backend, that is all JavaScript as well. So I don't want you guys to be panicking about these concepts, right? We will definitely be drilling them in and getting more and more practice across the projects, but also balance that with, hey, if this isn't sinking in class, it may be that I've got the floodgate up, right? And what I may need to do is go find one other resource that really clicks for me. Excuse me, because if that will help me with the fundamentals, if that will open the floodgates, that can get everything else in class to start clicking and making sense, right? You may be hung up at just that one spot, and all it takes is that one right resource to really get everything flowing. So if you're at that point, if you are trying the different resources, if you are like, hey, I'm a couple days into this, I feel like I'm just zoning out on the movie project, something's not working here. We're starting week 3 of 6 of JavaScript. We're at that halfway point, and something's still not working. That's when it's time to schedule a one-on-one, right? That's when it's time for me to try and help you figure out, where is the holdup? Is it a vocabulary thing? Is it a project-based learning thing? Is it a I need videos to learn from? Is it I need a textbook to go to, right? We can kind of talk through all of that together. And if it doesn't work with me, reach out to Jason, right? Jason may be able to provide a different perspective, or your mentor will definitely be assigned this week, and you can reach out to them and get a different perspective. And all of our mentors except one are graduates of the program, right? And so the benefit of that is they will be able to say, oh yeah, Max was smoking something when he did the movie project. All of us got held up at this point. This is the thing that made sense, or this is how it we got past it. Wish my lungs would let me smoke something as a lifelong asthmatic, but lots of different resources here, right? So if you are feeling stuck, please don't get in your head about it. Lean out and go for and use all the resources while you're here. And yes, we will definitely be doing the drop down. Sorry, I just opened the chat, and I am definitely not opposed to edibles. All right, we ready to get started? Okay. We are going to dive in the way we always dive in. We are going to head to our My Code folder. We are going to make our week 8 folder. We are going to make our day 1 folder. I'm going to take our day 1, throw it in VS Code. We are going to create 3 files, our index.html with our exclamation point enter, and we'll say movies as the title. We are going to make another file called script.js and our final file called style.css. The live share is going in the chat. Flintstone is really cool though. I also want to check out, there's a new place in DeWitt that just opened like 2 or 3 weeks ago. Right in Shoppingtown Mall. It actually used to be the old Helping Hounds building before they moved into a much bigger facility. So I want to check that out as well. It is
Heard
not
some good
cheap.
things about them. That's really like right down the street from me. I heard really good things though.
Yeah, right across from Lemoyne. Yeah, I want to check them out, but I think a lot of those prices are just through the roof because of taxes, but then you get, safety screenings and regulations and all of that stuff. So okay. In our index.html, we are going to link our style sheet, rel style sheet href is going to our style.css. We are also going to throw our script tag in with an src to our script.js. This is one of the only projects that we actually don't use Bootstrap on. With that said, a lot of people like to finish these projects before they put them up on their portfolio. They like to go in and style it, right? And that's a great way to get practice with your CSS to make it look not so black and white, kind of play around with it. So those are all things that I can encourage you to do. We are going to go to our script.js. I'm going to throw that on the bottom part of the screen. We are going to add a console.log JS linked. We are going to go to our style.css, and we are going to say, hey, the whole body of this site is going to be text aligned center. And then we are going to head to our body, and we are going to throw in a H1 tag that says Max's Movies. And finally, we are going to go live. That is where I will pause for a second and let you guys catch up. There are two things that we're looking for in our go live. Your movie title should be centered. If it is not there or not centered, there is something wrong with your style CSS linking. We also want to head to the console and see that we have JS linked here. If you do not have your JS linked, there is either something wrong with your script.js or with the script tag linking it together. So 3 files that we have touched, all 3 of them are on the screen. Again, check for your movie title centered. Also check for your JS linked in the console. If you have an error about a favicon missing or favicon missing, a 404, that is okay. That is normal. That happens on a lot of projects. Not anything we need to worry about. Give me a minute. I will wait for our heads to stop swiveling around to know you guys are all caught up. Random reminder, we are off for Juneteenth, which is a middle of the week. It is Wednesday, 6/19. We are off for that Wednesday night. We will be back on Thursday, though. It's a little reminder for you, something to look forward to.
So with the FavCon thing, when will we ever like use it, or rather like how like when will we ever implement that? Is it like when we like have like a little image and put it on like a little? Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you go to Google, you'll see Google has like the G in the circle up here, or if you go to msn.com, you'll see that that's like the little butterfly icon. Those favicons, they have to be in a very specific format, and you can have them in multiple resolutions as well. So if you just do a search for favicon generator, you can upload an image and it will let you download basically the favicon.ico file. And then if you just put that in the root folder, so like the folder that the live server is running off of, the browser will automatically find it and show that. So instead of it showing up as like a little globe, it would show up as whatever favicon you put in there. But you do want to run that through a generator, because you can't just like take a JPEG and name it favicon.ico and have it work. And they also have to be really tiny images. So, they're below a certain file size, but the generator will usually take care of all of that for you. If you're making like a full-fledged website that is going out onto the production internet, it's always a good idea to have a favicon. But you can also make kind of like a personal logo and use that on all of your different projects until you get to a production-based website. And then oftentimes they'll have a logo or something that you can use for that favicon. Okay, everyone good? Anyone need a minute? Anyone not have their text centered or not have JS linked in the console? I'm also going to drop in the link to the fully finished project in the chat. So if you want to pull that up and reference that, you are totally welcome to. If you are on window overload right now and don't need another freaking window, that is also totally fine. Okay. So the first thing that I notice about our final version is this little text here. It says select movie to see seating options. So we're going to put that in. Always, before we make any new elements, we always want to make sure that we are placing them in the right spot. The script tag should always be the last thing in the body, or almost always should be the last thing in the body. So I want that to be underneath my H1. I'm going to add a new line there. I'm going to add not an OP tag because that's not real. I'm going to add a P tag and say select a movie to see seating options. I'm going to go ahead and save that. Then I am going to go into my movies and make sure that that shows up. It does. And so we are good to go onto the next element. The next element is a drop down with all of our movie titles. But I'm going to just work with placeholders in this HTML because I want all of this data to live in our JavaScript, right? When we talk about source of truth, we mean, okay, there's all of this information out there. What is the one place that I know will always be correct? And 99% of the time, we want that to be our JavaScript, right? Because we can always update our HTML based off of whatever is in our JavaScript. It is much harder to kind of work around the confines of HTML data in our JavaScript. So the way that we're going to want to think about this is, hey, our JavaScript has all of the data, and based off of whatever data is there, because it is much more flexible in its structuring with arrays and objects and numbers and all of that stuff, we're going to update our HTML based off of that. But we do need our HTML to be generated enough that we basically have holes that our JavaScript can punch into and update the content of that HTML. So we are going to make a select tag. We will throw an ID on that of movie selection. And then we're going to put a couple options in there. When the page first loads, the select box, right, is empty. In order to achieve that, we need to put an empty option into our select. Then we are going to do two other options. We will do one that says example movie, and we'll say it's $10. And then we will do another example movie that is $20. We save, we come over to our dropdown. We see example movie number 1, example movie number 2. We have it blank up here, and now we officially have a starting point. Okay. We then go back and we look at our interface, and when we pick a movie, it generates out these seats. And if we look at this, it looks like it is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Did I count that right? No, it's an 8 by 8 grid. So we need to get 64 chairs showing up here. And I'm like, that seems like it's going to be a lot of HTML that is repeating itself. So maybe what we do is we get the first row showing up, and then we'll get the second seat in the second row showing up. And then we need to think through what's an easy way in our JavaScript to be able to put all of those seats in without us literally having to put 64 chairs into our HTML. But worthwhile to do for the 8 of them, so we can get them there, we can get them laid out. We can make sure that there are little columns here so we understand like those are the rows, and we can get our screen showing up down at the bottom. Terry.
Well, I think I might be getting a little ambitious, but when we put like a for loop for like those chairs?
We will, but you are, I wouldn't say you're getting ambitious, you're getting a step ahead of yourself, right? Because what we want to do once we get into the JavaScript is we want to say, well, when do those chairs show up? So we need to add the onChange event to this select. Then we need to say, well, what is that data based off of? And we need to get into all of that. So before we get into the for loop, before we get, fancy, we want to have the basic concept of it working in our HTML, because when we have it working in our HTML, it makes it easier to set it up in our JavaScript. So when it goes horribly wrong, we can go, well, this is what we know is working in the HTML. What is the JavaScript doing wrong that it doesn't look like that? So we don't need to necessarily do all 64 seats, but we want to do an entire row of seats, make sure we've got that layout working first. And then once we have that working, it becomes much easier to dynamically generate that. So your head's in the right spot, but we want to do the basic version first and then work our way up to that for loop, which we will definitely be doing. Okay. So in order to get those chairs showing up, those don't look like emojis. So those are icons. And where do we get our icons from? I use material icons from Google. So we're going to do a Google search for Google material icons. We are going to search for a seat. And chair is what comes up. So that's what I want to be using. You're welcome to use any icons that you would like, even if they are bootstrap icons or font awesome or any of those. That is totally fine. I'm going to use these. So I'm going to click on the chair. I'm going to scroll past the variable icon font and go down to the static icon font. This is the one that I want to be working with. So I'm going to copy that link rel style sheet. I'm going to come over to my head tag, and before my link, I'm going to go ahead and paste in the link rel style sheet to Google Fonts. Then I'm going to come down to my inserting the icon, copy that, come over to my select, and now I'm like, all right, I got to think about what does this final version look like? I probably want all of the seats in one big div. So what I'm going to do is make a new div with an ID of seats. And now I need to think ahead a little bit, because I don't want just 64 span tags of seats. Really what I want is a row of those seats. So we are going to have one big div that holds all of the seats, and then each row will be its own nested div inside of that. So I will make a div, and in that div, I'm going to put 8 seats. So I'm going to hit paste 8 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Go ahead and save and let Prettier clean that up for me. And now I've got my 8 seats showing up. And do one more step. Now that I have that working, I just want one more row of seats, but we'll just put one chair in it for now to make sure we understand how that HTML is working. So I'm going to put in another div. I'm going to paste in one chair there. It isn't positioned properly, but at least it's there. So I'm going to pause there. We made our div ID seats. We made a div for each of the rows. Then we put in 8 different chairs after we pasted in this link tag from Google Fonts. We then created another div and put one chair in that row. And now we are done and all caught up. So if you look at your browser, you should have 8 seats in a row and then one row with 1 seat in it. If you have the word chair showing up 8 times instead of an icon of a chair, you may have installed that link tag incorrectly and need to fix that. So I'm going to start a poll there and make sure that we are not losing anyone. Four of you still need to vote. 3 of you. All right, looks like everyone. Anyone need 1 more minute? Okey-doke. So the last thing that I noticed about this design it has the word screen in it, right? And it's just to give you an idea of, well, where's the screen? What's the first row here, right? Is the first row at the top or is the first row down at the bottom? So we are going to figure out where that is. Now we're getting into a little bit of div soup here, so let's do some comments. This is the end of first row of seats. This is the end of second row of seats. This must mean that is the end of seats container. And now that we know that this div is the end of the seats container, we can do one final div down at the bottom that has the word screen in it. So I save, I come over, I get the word screen showing up, and I am good to go. With all of that said, this is not quite looking like this. So we can spend some time in CSS to clean that up, and believe it or not, it's just 2 lines of CSS that we need to target in order to get that to work, I think. Where is... Okay. So, first thing I notice about ours is that there's not a gap between the seats, right? And I want there to be like a little bit of an aisle. Well, what I could do is add an ID to the second chair or a class to the second chair and the 7th chair and say, hey, margin right or margin left, kind of push that over a little bit, right? And I definitely do want margin, but there's a way of doing that without actually adding any classes. So we get a little fancy in our style CSS, in our selector. We say, hey, go find the seats div right here. And in that div, there is going to be another div, right? This is the div for all of the rows. And then target the span, right? Because all of these chairs are just spans, but we are going to use what is called a pseudo selector. And we say nth child. What does nth child mean? It means, hey, in this div has child elements inside of it. It's got all of these different span tags. And we want the third span. So we say nth child 3. And what do we want to do to the third nth child? We want to add margin to the left of it of 25 pixels. And just like that, we get a little gap between the seats. How does it know to only do the gap right there? Because we said find the third seat. So 0 or 1, 2, 3, the third seat, add 10 pixels to the left of it. We also want to do it, you got it, Mo, for the 7th. So we're going to copy this, put a comma, paste it, and change 3 to 7. Now we are saying, go to the seats, go find a div. in that div, there will be a span, and the third span is what we want to apply it to. We also want to do that again and apply it to the 7th child. What do we want to apply? We want to apply this gap. And the final thing we're going to do is get our screen working. So I'm going to go down to that div, add an ID of screen on that, target my screen, and then say, hey, we're going to throw a border on that of 1px solid black. We will add a height to it of, I don't know, 30 pixels and a width to it of 200 pixels. Like, okay, that's not quite what I wanted to do. So let's play with that a little bit. We'll say height needs to probably be 75 pixels. Okay, better. And then let's put a margin on that of 0 auto. That centers it for me. And then what's the final one look like? We also need to let me do padding on the top of 30 pixels and maybe bring my height back down to 45. Okay, that works. We'll take our height out altogether. And just like that, we've got our screen showing up. So the final CSS on this, I took out the height, let the browser calculate the height for me. Usually the better thing to do anyway, threw some padding on the top of it, and we are good to go. Pause there, let's catch up. We've only made changes to the style.css with these two classes. The only thing that we did was add an ID of screen to our screen div and our ID of seats to the seats div. This is what it should look like. If yours does not look like that, give you a minute and then raise your hand if you need any help. While you guys are waiting, you can go head to attendance. Tonight's secret word is blockbuster. Go to attendance. Secret word is blockbuster. Any of you are too young to remember that store.
The joy you felt when you can get your own Blockbuster card, y'all never know.
We not
But I'm
that young.
old.
We had Blockbuster.
Did you
Love
have a
Blockbuster.
Blockbuster card?
I did, for
Yeah,
sure.
we had a card.
Yeah, the card is. You
Yeah,
know.
my parents did. Not me. But I was there.
Yeah. You was around. You was in proximity.
hmm
Yeah, I definitely did DVDs from Netflix as well. That was actually more of my jam than Blockbuster probably was. I always was like super efficient too. I'm like, all right, movie's coming in Tuesday. I gotta have my schedule cleared and mail it back like, Thursday morning. Like I can do this. No GameFly. I'm not a
I
huge
used to
video
do
game person.
GameFly, especially for the Grand Theft Auto. I was not allowed to purchase that, but my cousin had a GameFly account, so it was good. We got the Grand Theft Auto going.
Nice. All right. Good news is we are done with our HTML and we are mostly done with our CSS, believe it or not. The bad news is we have about 300 lines of JavaScript we need to write in the next 3 days. and we are gonna write it. So we're gonna pause here. Does anyone have general questions about HTML, about styling of the CSS, about why we did things in this order, about where we're headed in the project? Right? We always want to take these breather breaks and go, do I know where I'm at right now? Because if we don't know where we're at, we have no chance of headed to where we're headed next.
It's a little bit not as relevant as your example, but I noticed that the screen box was a little bit larger in our working thing than the other, so I dropped the pattern down to 20.
Yeah, that's totally fine.
Okay, cool.
You can play around with any of the screen spacing, or if you don't like the aisles where they are, you can play around with that spacing. Or if you want to do margin between the elements to give them a little bit more breathing room, that's all totally fine. That won't affect anything as we're working on it. So feel free to make it your own. Joe.
This is a syntax question for
Yeah.
the CSS targeting the nth child. I know it's not technically nesting, but isn't there another way to do that other than the right arrow?
Yep, you could write that as seats. It is nesting, div, and then span and child free and margin left that. And then, too many. And then copy that and do one more for 7. And then if we take this out, it will do the same exact thing.
Okay, I remember something vaguely like a little different. It was still kind of like, what's the difference between that and the just putting a space in between to target another thing that's in there instead of
Yeah.
using the right arrows?
Good question. We can technically take out this entire div, and this should also work. So what the arrows say is a direct descendant. So you're saying go find a div ID of seats, and then only find the this div if it is directly in underneath the seats. Compared to what this is saying is go find ID of seats, and then go find a span nth child 3 anywhere in the seats div. So if we said this wouldn't work, right? We lose our gap there because the span nth child is not a direct descendant of seats. It's got that div in between. Compared to leaving that out, it says it doesn't matter however many levels nested it is, as long as it's in the div ID seats, that's all that matters.
Gotcha.
So yeah, all different ways of doing it. In general, the more specific your selector is, the better it is. So you don't accidentally like add another div to that or another span. And then like all of a sudden you're like, crap, I've got margin applied to something I didn't mean to apply it to. But in terms of code readability, it is probably a little bit easier to not have that specificity and just say, hey, go apply it to any third child span tag. But I'll get the job done. Terry.
What is the NIF child like doing? Like, I'm not really understanding that.
Yeah, so if we take that out, what we will find is that all of the chairs have the spacing on it. And I'm like, I don't want all the chairs to have the spacing on it. I only want the third chair right here and the 7th chair to have margin on the left of them. So what nth child lets us do is instead of having to come up to this third chair here and the 7th chair right here and add a new class to it that says aisle seat, which we could do, instead what this allows us to do is say, hey, the 3rd seat and the 7th seat, basically the 3rd span tag that you find in this div right here should get the spacing on the left of it. Does that help?
Yeah, kind of. So is it going by like index, like how zeros is like?
But in
One.
CSS, it's not 0 indexed like it is
Okay.
in JavaScript. So
Okay.
the first one, the first span right here is actually child 1. Compared to in JavaScript, it would be child 0. Good question.
Yeah, that was the part that was getting me confused a little bit. Appreciate it.
Yep. Any other questions? All right. We are going to get started in our JavaScript. So the first thing we need to do as a user experience, right, is when they change this drop down, I need it to load in all of the seats that are available. Believe it or not, that is going to take us until the end of class to get that working. With that said, when I open this drop down, I immediately run into a problem of, well, this is example movie 1 and 2. I want to actually load up my data. So oftentimes we want to take a step back and say, how should we be structuring this data? And in order to know what we need to structure, we need to know what the data is in general, right? So let's think about this. We need the title of the movie, we need the price of the movie, and we need to keep track of all of the seats for that movie. Now, you could say, Max, what about show times, right? That movie shows multiple times. Yes, you're right. Let's not overcomplicate here, right? We got enough of a challenge on our hands. We're going to say that these movies only show once a day, but they do have different prices. We do have to keep track of the seats, and we have to keep track of the title. Now, there are multiple data types that we are going to use for that, but what comes to my mind is, hey, we need to group this information together, and there are multiple pieces of information that all relate to one thing. So that to me says object. Now, what's the difference between an object and array and an array? An array is a list. And we could put all of the movies in a list of movies, but we want to think about how are we going to access that data? What we really want to be able to do is say, hey, go to the movies and give me the movie data about The Godfather, right? We don't want to say, oh, The Godfather is movie index number 3, and we have that memorized so we can use it. That's not really helpful, right? It's more helpful to be able to say, give me the Godfather movie data, the price, and the seats, as opposed to having to search through a list of items to find that one specific piece of information that we're looking for. Could you do this as an array? Absolutely. You'd have to write your queries a little different. You'd have to find that item in the array. But instead, when we think about, hey, I have this key called The Godfather, and when I say movies dot The Godfather, I can get out all of the data that I'm looking for. So that's what we're going to do. Terry, go ahead.
Sorry, but going back to that Nef child, does that work with like images like inside like your root folder?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you can use nth child or almost any pseudo selector on any kind of element. And it doesn't matter how nested down it is, you can definitely do that. You just want to be careful around, hey, is this something that is going to be easier for me to just add a class to, or is this something where I'm like, it will always be the third and seventh thing in this that gets space between it. So you just have to decide, should I add a class to this, or is it easier to select it based off of the number of the item? Okay, so in our script.js, we are going to make a const, and we're going to call it movies. And movies is going to be an object. So an object means curly braces. If we wanted it to be an array, we would use square braces. And I'm going to get started with just 3 movies to make this easier on ourselves. So I'm going to say, quote, The Godfather. You are welcome to use whatever movies you would like. And then I'm going to put colon, because the colon is what separates out the key of the object from the value of the object. Objects can have values of any data types. However, keys are always strings. So we have this in quotes. That means that this is a string. All objects use strings as their keys. Because it has a space in the key name, we do need to use those quotes. And then we are going to put our curly braces to set up our value. And our value needs to have a couple other pieces of information in it. It needs to have the price of the movie. This one is going to be $8. And so we don't include the unit. We don't put the $ in there. We just use the number itself. So we know all prices are going to be numbers. And then it also needs to know the seats. And the seats are not something that we would access with an object, right? We're going to access the seat by index. What row is this in? What column is this in? In order to make that work, we are going to work with an array. Now, there's nothing in that array yet because we are going to dynamically generate out those seats in order to store all the information that we want. Now, we want to get that working for 3 movies. So I'm going to copy my entire object. I'm going to make sure that there's a comma after the inner closing curly brace, and I'm going to paste 2 more movies. I will add in Citizen Kane, which will be $9, and I don't know, Planet of the Apes. And that one will be $10. Save, come back over to your browser, make sure you have no errors in your console. If you do have errors in your console, there's a syntax error. Look for your red squigglies. If you still have an error and can't figure out why, raise your hand now. I'm going to check as we're going, right? Because it's really easy to get really far into this project and then go, oops, we're missing, we have a syntax error somewhere and we got to track that down. So we want to test anytime we get something accomplished, we got our data structure made, we can save, we can go check, we can make sure that there are no errors. Everyone good? Nope. Okay. Give me another minute. You know how they have easy buttons at Staples? I need to give everyone like a no button. So when I ask, does anyone need another minute or is everyone good? You can just slam the no button.
While we're waiting, can you just
Mhm.
explain that whole part one more time?
Yeah,
The
so we got,
constant movies.
yep. So we have 3 different data types that we're working with here, and they're all kind of nested in each other, right? So the const is saying, hey, we're making a new variable, and that whole object isn't going to change. Then we name that variable and we call it movies, right? So that when we reference this down the road, we will say movies and be able to access that. The equals is saying, hey, we're storing a value into movies. And what are we storing into it? So we use curly braces to say that's going to be an object. Now we could have used square brackets or braces for a list of all of the movies, but we're thinking ahead a little bit here. Do we want to be accessing these movies by their index number? Do we want to say movies bracket 3 and know that Planet of the Apes would be in well, 3 is a bad example, index 2? That's going to get confusing, right? When we think about these movies, we're not trying to access them by the number of the movie. We're accessing them by the title of the movie. So that's why we use an object. Thinking through an object versus an array, could we make this app fully functional if we made it an array instead of an object? Yes, absolutely. But we want to think about that as, are we accessing this by the number of the movie, or do we want to be able to access this by the title? And that's why we did an object. So we did The Godfather, we did Citizen Kane, we did Planet of the Apes. All 3 of those are keys of the object. we use keys to access the values. What are the values of that? It is actually a nested object. So each movie will get its own object. Why an object instead of an array? Because we want to be able to say dot price and be able to get the price of the movie, not the movie index 0, and know that the value is stored in there. Again, anything that we can build as an object, we can use an array instead. This is more just what makes it easier to access it. So we say price is the key. The value is 8. The value happens to be a number here. The value can be any data type. And then we also have seats, but seats we set up as an empty array. So there, we haven't put any of those seats in there yet. But when we're thinking about our seats, we want to say, hey, that seat is in row 3, column 4, right? And in order to achieve that, we want a list of all of the seats. And we're actually going to use what we call a multi-dimensional array here. We're going to have an array in an array. But that seats is kind of just a placeholder for now, right? We're not actually filling up those seats yet. All we're doing is saying, hey, at some point, there will be a list of all of the seats in here. If we wanted to leave this out right now, we totally could. And then as we needed it, we could add it in, but we're kind of just thinking in advance, what are the 3 pieces of information that we need to know about every movie? Well, we need to know the title of the movie, we need to know the price of the movie, and we need to know the seats of the movie. And because all 3 of those are related to each other, we use an object to store all of that information.
Thanks.
Of course. Now, keep in mind, in a college course, when you're learning about data structures, you'd spend a week or 2 on data structures. Instead, we go, we kind of need data structures to use our applications, so we just start using them, right? So those clarifying questions are really helpful to say, all right, let me get that terminology in. Let me make sure I'm understanding the syntax. Why did we use a square bracket on seats compared to a curly brace on the object itself, right? Breaking that down, figuring out what data we need to experience, that is all important. Okay. Any other questions before we keep going? Anyone have an error? Okay. So now I go back over to my page. I'm like, I just did all of that work. I click on the drop down and I've got 2 things in the drop down that are not what I have in my data. So the first thing we need to do is not even get this on change working. We need to make sure that the data that we have in our JavaScript, again, the ultimate source of truth, the one thing that we always want to go back to and make our HTML reflect, that is what we need to get working in the page. So first we need to say, all right, we need to get these movies showing up in this dropdown. That is our English statement, right? That is our one sentence that we said, what is our goal? Get that working. So we're going to write that out as a comment. We're going to say, update the select dropdown to have the movies, titles, and prices show as values. So now when we're working on this, when we're frustrated, when we get stuck, we can go back to this and say, what is this? What are we trying to do? Because sometimes we get stuck on an error and we get so worked up and involved in the error, we can't remember what we got the error on the first place. So now that we've got that written out, we can say, all right, how do we do that? Well, in order to be able to select the dropdown, I need to reach into my HTML up here and store that in a JavaScript variable that I can access. So I'm going to say const movie dropdown is equal to document get element by ID. And the ID that I want to get is movie selection. Why are we putting parentheses? Because get element by ID is a function that is built into JavaScript. Why am I putting parentheses? Because those parentheses are telling it, I want to run that function. I want you to go into the HTML and grab something. Why did we put quotes? Because we are sending it a parameter, actually an argument, into a parameter that says, what element do you want me to go get? So this is the argument. This is telling the function how I want it to work based off of what input. Now, in order to know this is working, before we get too far, what we want to do is console log out our movie dropdown. Now, in our console, we should see this select here. If we don't see the select, we know there's a problem with our ID here, or our ID here, or something with this line of code. But before we get too far, when we reach into the HTML and ask our JavaScript to grab it, we want to make sure that it can find it, that we see it. Now that we have it, we got to say, all right, what do we want to shove into it? Well, what we want to do is take all of these movie titles, The Godfather, Citizen Kane, Planet of the Apes, and generate them out as options. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, we're going to make a new variable called options. And options is going to start out as a string. And what we need to do is have this blank option be in the string to get started. Because when we generate out all the options, we still want that first empty option to be there. So when the page first loads, the select shows up as blank. So we start out all of the options as this string with the empty option tag in it. Now we want to loop over all three of these objects. But we get into something interesting here. We've looped over arrays before, and when we loop over arrays, we get each item, right? We do a for loop for that. But the problem is, this is now an object that we're looping over. Well, how do we loop over that? Well, what we can do is actually use a function called object.entries. So if we say object.entries of the movies, let's see what that does. Object.entries is a built-in function in JavaScript. If I save that and come over here, I get something interesting. I get arrays of arrays going on. And I'm like, wait a second, it's an array. That means I can loop over it. What else is going on in this array? So if I click into it, I can see the first item in the array is the title of the movie. And if I look into the second item of the array, it's the object of the value. So what is object.entries doing? It's giving us access to the key of the object and the value of that key in an array. Because it's in an array, that means we can loop over it. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to say for, and we're going to say const, and that is going to give us the movie title and the movie data. And where does that come from? How many times should this for loop run? We want that for loop to run for every one of the object.entries of the movie data. Oop, not semicolon. So I'm going to comment out these console logs so we don't get too lost in that data. And what I'm going to do is console log out instead the movie title and the movie data. Okay, let's break that down a little bit. Ooh. This should be movies. My bad. Movies here, not movie data. We'll get an error if you have movie data there. It should be movies. Okay, let's break this down a little visually here. If we look at what logged out, we said object.entries. Let me try and position this right. So, okay. First things first, we take movies and we dump that into our object.entries down here. What does object.entries do? It gives us each entry of that object. So it is going to take out The Godfather and store that into the movie title right here. It is then going to take this value of The Godfather, this entire object, and dump it into the movie data right here. And it does that using an array. So because these are arrays, what we are able to do is access the data inside of them and also loop over that. So what do we get from all of that? Well, the first array has 2 items in it. The first item is the movie title. The second item is the movie data. And we can see that right here. The Godfather is what is getting dumped into the movie title. And what gets dumped into the second item of the array? The movie data, which includes the price and the seats. So basically, object.entries is a way that we can convert our object that we initialized right here as movies into 2 parts, an array that contains the movie title and the movie data. So this array right here is coming from this array that we can see in the console log. And because we loop over it for each one of the movies, when we get Citizen Kane, we can see that this array right here is what gets dumped in when the loop runs. And then the final time the loop runs, we get Planet of the Apes, which again gets dumped in to the movie title and the movie data, which we log out here. So object.entries is definitely a more advanced way of working with data. But do we have any questions about it so far?
Yes. So, does the words movie title and movie data, did we get that from the inspector?
No, we just made them up. So
Oh,
you
okay.
could, if you wanted to, you could call this key and value. And if you called it key and value right here, you would get the exact same thing. But when we're looking at our code here, if I just said value, you'd be like, value of what? Right? Like, what's value have in it? And then I'd be like, well, it has the price and the seats. And then you'd be like, yeah, but what's value mean, right? And so what we want to do is be as descriptive with our variables without going overboard. Because if I just said key, you could be like, okay, key of what? Oh, of the entries from the movies. What does movies have? Movies has these keys right here. So maybe that's the key that we're talking about. But isn't it better to instead be descriptive here and say, well, what's going to be in the key of our entries of the movies? It's going to be the title. So we're going to be a little bit more descriptive there. And instead of just saying key and value, which does work, and we could write all of our code for that, instead we're setting us up for success and going, well, what's that data actually represent? The key represents the title. What does the value represent? It represents the data, the seats, and the price. Could we call that movie price and seats? Yes, that would work, right? You're getting a little too descriptive there, maybe, but yeah, that would totally work as long as we are consistent with it.
Okay. And those items are selected because of the object.entry syntax.
Correct. The objects, the object.entries is transforming our object, which is harder to loop over, into an array structure, and because it's an array, we can loop over it easier.
Okay. Thank you.
Good questions. Joe.
You might have just answered it right there, but what's the difference between that and the map function?
Map. Ooh.
Is it because it's not organizing it into an array?
Dot map. I usually, no. There is no native dot map. So there are lots of different loops, right? Obviously, for loops, while loops, do while loops. Dot map is another function that is also looping, just like there's for each, which is similar to dot map. Dot map is usually only used when we're trying to generate a new array based off an existing array. With that said, you cannot natively map over an object. So what you could do is object.entries and then dot map over that array, and that would also work. But because we aren't trying, our output here is not generating a new array, we don't use dot map. So dot map is usually used to map an existing array into a differently formatted array.
Gotcha.
Good question, though. And we will heavily use .map when we get into React. I'm more of a for of loop fan. Ryan's more of a .for each fan. Once you get into React, all of a sudden, all you want to do is map over things. So multiple ways of achieving this. But in this case, because we're looping, it's I lean into a for of loop.
Gotcha.
And Asma asked a good question. She said, do we camel case in JavaScript as well? Camel casing is definitely where JavaScript is kind of the key of camel casing. While we don't need to camel case necessarily in CSS, we can use snake case or a couple other options there because variable names cannot have a space in them. In JavaScript, we almost always camel case our variables. So it is language specific, and CSS doesn't really care. So you will see snake case and camel case kind of used interchangeably. But in JavaScript, they specify in the specification of the JavaScript requirements that they prefer camel casing variable names. Terry, I see you off mute. Did you have a question? Take that as a no.
I do.
Yeah, shoot.
I'm gonna share my screen.
Go for it.
Look at this. This prototype underneath my array
Yeah.
are these like methods I can use? to do
They
stuff?
they are, but you probably wouldn't. So the
Okay.
prototype is, yes, what defines the all of the methods that are available on objects. There are a couple in there, like dot length that you could use. But I would highly advise you not go down the rabbit hole of prototypes until you're feeling comfortable, a lot more comfortable with JavaScript. It's more of an under the hood feature. But yes, theoretically, you could use that. And if you call .toString, you actually would get the output of that function.
Cool. Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, so now we've got our loop running. And when we look at the output of our console log, we've got the movie title as the first thing coming out of our console log and the movie data as the object that's coming out. That means that because it is an object, I am basically getting access to this whole object here. So if I wanted to, I could say movie data dot price, and now I get 8, 9, and 10 coming out.
Mm.
Why? Because the movies is getting broken up into the movie data, which is becoming this whole object, which means that because this is an object, I can say dot price. It will go into that object and get out the value of that object. Okay, that's pretty cool. So what do I want to do for each one of the movies that I now have access to the title and the data? Well, I want to make an option show up for each one of those movies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say options. Oh, this line options should be above our for loop. Sorry, my bad. Let options needs to exist before we can add to it. And what do we want to add to it? We want to add to it what we call a template literal. I know that we got a dash of this last night. We're going to see it again. Our options, we are going to plus equal. What does plus equal means? It means concatenate on to the end of whatever options has in it. And what we want to add to it is an option. And we don't want to forget our option tag. So far, this is working just like a string works like. But because these are backticks and not quotes, I'm using the key above the tab button between tab and escape. That is a backtick. You may have never used that key before if you are only an English speaker. Okay. Now, what do we want to show up in that option? Well, I would like the movie title to show up. But if I just type the word movie title in and then console log out all of my options, we get option, option movie title, option movie title, option movie title. So I'm like, well, that's not what I want. I want the actual movie title value to show up. So in a template literal, what we are able to do is say, no. By default, I want the letters that I'm typing into that template to show up. But because this is a template, I want you to use this pattern to drop in the actual value of the movie title. So I do $quote, $curly brace. And now whatever is in that curly brace, I am going to get the value of that. So now if I look over here, I've got The Godfather, Citizen Kane, and Planet of the Apes. We could achieve this using concatenation. We could have a quote that says option, then we do a plus sign after the quotes and we say movie title, and then we have a plus sign and quotes with our closing option tag. Template literals can always be achieved using concatenation. But oftentimes it's very easy to get lost in all of that concatenation, right? With all those pluses, all those quotes, making sure they line up, making sure that the variable names are not in quotes. It gets really easy to get lost when we're concatenating multiple strings together. So instead, we use this template literal to say, all right, I want these letters to show up. That's the literal part of this. But then the template part of this is whenever I have those $ curly braces, hold up, go get the value and drop that in where this whole thing shows up instead. So what we also want to do is include the price of the movie. So what we are going to do is we'll put that in parentheses. And then we will say, hey, I want the $ to actually show up. And then I would like a new piece of the template for the movie data dot price. So now when I save that and look in my console, I have these options showing up. Almost at break time. I promise I will leave time for questions after break. Do not work through break. Taking a break, giving your brain a reset is important. We're going to do one final thing here to make all of this come together. I've done all of this work on this options string, and I can see all of those options showing up in my console. And I'm like, this is really cool, but I still have example movie 1 and 2 here. I've worked with my object. I've gotten really fancy on the data. I've extracted out the information into an array so I can loop over it. I've used all of that data in our template literal to generate out what the option should look like. The very last thing we need to do is go to our movie dropdown and set its inner HTML equal to the options we have generated. So I save that, I come over here, I open my dropdown, and now I've got my movies showing up in the dropdown. I'm going to pause there and go on break. If you're a minute or two away of getting it working, great, do that, then go on break. If you are more than a couple minutes away, go on break. I will give you time to work on this after break. It's important to walk around, give your eyes a break. Got an hour of class left, hour and 5 minutes of class left after break. So we will go through all of this and review this, including a review of the template literal and how else we could achieve it. If you are stuck, raise your hand to get in line after break, and we will go through your problems. You can delete lines 18 is just a comment, so you can always delete a comment. 19 you can't delete because we need to get the movie selection, and we use that movie dropdown to update the inner HTML. Break until 7:25. Yes. Oh, yeah. Sorry, the lines don't always line up. So the console logs, you can take out. That's just more of a like a helpful thing to go through it. So if that is, you can delete those, and you can also delete 18 and 19 of the HTML. Yes, those are getting overwritten, so we don't need them anymore. But they're also not hurting anything because we're overwriting it. So from a code cleanliness thing, yes, you should delete them, but you don't have to. Break until 7:25. And we will do the numbering of all of the steps here before the end of class. We'll spend at least 15 minutes kind of going through as a review at the end of the night. Okay, go on break. Be back 7:25. All right. Did anyone over the break run into any issues? Does anyone not have their drop down filling in their movie titles? Does anyone need another minute? Where are we at? You should not have example movies left in your drop down. You should only have the 3 movies in our object.
Mine is not working.
Share your screen. And Asma, we'll come to you next. Cannot set properties of null setting inner HTML. So what that is telling us is on line 30, it has a problem.
What's the problem?
Give me remote.
Come on. My mouse doesn't want to go over. There we go.
Thank you. Okay, so let's trace it because it's saying line 30, right? So what are we trying to do? We're trying to take options, which we defined up here, and that we added everything to correctly right here. And we're trying to put it inside the inner HTML of the movie dropdown. So it's saying cannot set properties. Well, the property we're trying to set is inner HTML of null. And we're like, okay, well, what are we trying to set the property on? The movie dropdown. Where does the movie dropdown come from? It comes from up here when we get the element by ID movie selection. Well, where's movie selection coming from? That is coming from our index.html, where we have movie space selection.
Oh.
And so if we fix that, well, there we go. Now, not only did that error go away, but we've got our movies just super teeny tiny.
Got it.
Why are your options so teeny tiny? We come out of mobile mode. Does that fix it? Yeah, that fixes it. Okay. So you're good to go. Of
Thank you.
course. Asma, you want to share your screen?
Can you see that okay?
I can. So you probably have an error in your browser console that says oh no, never mind. Here we go. So you've got your for loop here, and the whole point of a for loop is to run something over multiple times. What is it running over multiple times?
The movies and the seating.
Yep.
And
And how does
price.
it know what it's supposed to do for each one of those?
The console.log. I'm not sure.
Yes, that console.log should be inside curly braces.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So the curly braces are telling it, hey, this is the block of code that we want to run for each one of the movie titles and movie data. And so those curly braces should hopefully fix your problem. Check in the browser and make sure it's working.
Okay. That works. Thank you.
Of course. Anyone else? Going once, going twice. Okay. So I do want to review this this template literal one more time, because what we're doing here is we're basically building out the string, right? When we look at what console logs out here, we can see everything that it's building. And in fact, we can actually even go into this select. And if we expand this out, we can see the select with the 3 options plus the empty option. I'm like, well, where's that coming from? That if we look at our select up here, we've got example movie 1, example movie 2. Where are the options that we see here coming from? Well, what we're doing is we're looping over all of the movies. We're getting access to the data for each one of those movies. And then we are building out the option using a template literal. The template literal, again, is just a fancy string that uses backticks instead of single quotes or double quotes. So what we do is we say, make this string based off of a template where the template has the opening, close, and the opening tag and the closing tag in it. And it has these like $signs in parentheses so that when we actually look at this, we see 8, 9, and 10 showing up in our parentheses. So what's so special about the template literal? It is that when we take our $sign curly brace, it is now going to say, hold up, go get that movie title and drop the value of the movie title in here. So another way of writing this would be options plus equal, again, take whatever string we're generating, throw it onto the end of whatever is currently in options. And we could say, quote, option plus the movie title plus a quote that has the parenthesis and the $sign plus the movie data dot price plus a quote with the closing parenthesis and the closing option tag. This line of code does the exact same thing as this line of code. But look at how easy it is to get lost here in, should this be in quotes? No, it shouldn't be, because we want the actual price to be in there. But now we get really messy, right? Of, wait, what's this parenthesis for? Oh, it's in a quote. Oh, it's probably this closing parenthesis, right? It's very easy to get lost in that. So this and this do the exact same thing. If you're looking at this template literal and you're like, that confuses the crap out of me, string concatenation makes sense to me, that's totally fine. You can do that. But over time, we have found that this syntax, right, you can just look at the length of the line. This syntax is just much easier, the template literal, to read, to understand, to go, hey, oftentimes I do have this string that shows up for every one of them, and I just want to drop values in there. So this does the same exact thing, and to prove it, we will get 2 of the exact same outputs. If I include a quote there, you'll see we get 2 of the exact same thing because those lines are actually doing the exact same thing. So you only need one or the other here, but just to show you an example or an alternative of how you could do that with string concatenation. Okay, any questions on template literal? Everyone good? We will be using a lot of template literals in the future. However, if you prefer to do it with string concatenation, I will not judge you at all. Okay, come over here. We refresh. Now let's think about our user experience, our final product. What do we want to do? We want to make it so when this dropdown changes, we see the seats and the screen. Okay, lot to do there. The first thing we need to do is say, hey, when this changes. So we are going to target our movie dropdown and say on change, something's going to happen. The event happens. And what we need to know is not only, hey, when this thing changes, I want you to run a function. We also need to know what movie they selected after they changed that dropdown. In order to get that, we're going to say const selected movie equals our event. Event is a parameter that is coming in from the onChange function. Dot target, which is going to give us access to this actual select, and then get the value of it. Then console log out our selected movie so we can see if that is working. So we save, we come over, we change our movie with the console open, and we pick a movie. And what do we get? Citizen Kane, $9. And we can pick a different movie, and we get Planet of the Apes. Okay, well, now I need specific data about that movie, right? I need to know the seats information, or I need to know the price of the movie that got selected so that I can generate out and show what's supposed to be on the screen. So let's say I want to just get the price to get started. Well, I know selected movie has the value of the movie that I selected. So in theory, I should be able to say, hey, go to my movies all the way up here and use whatever selected movie was as the key to give me access to this object. So I come down here and I say, go to my movies, and I use square brackets to say, use a dynamic key, use whatever the event target value was, which we store in selected movie, to go up to the movie's object up here and retrieve out the object of the movie we selected. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. I come over here, I pick a movie, and I get undefined. And I'm like, well, what's going on there? I picked Citizen Kane. I know Citizen Kane is right here. Does anyone have guesses as to why the selected movie, which we know is working, is not going up to the movies object and getting out what we want?
We gotta target the movie data specifically.
Well, we're targeting
Yeah,
movies right here, and those movies line up with our movies object up here.
You gotta make a const for the movie, object for the movie data.
Nope, because we're console logging it out. right? We could console log out any like we could console log out an object with a key and a value. And we would get the key value coming out. So we don't need to store it in a new variable. Let's look at that selected movie again. When we look at that selected movie and we pick it, we see this. So we know we're getting access to the selected movie. We're taking this and we're trying to use that up here to get out the appropriate object. Why is this not being found here?
Oh, we already specified like we had like movies, right? We put movies in there, right?
Yep, right here.
Okay. Uh,
Because of the you have the dollar value attached.
Bingo. What do we have here? We not only have Citizen Kane, we also have this parenthesis $9. Well, that $9 isn't a part of the object keys here. So what we need to do is say, hey, we do want to display the movie title and the price to the user, but the value of that, what the computer tracks under the hood, is something different. So instead, in our option here, when we don't specify a value, that value is going to default to whatever we display to the user. Instead, what we want to do is say, hey, we're going to give you a value, and that value is going to be equal to the movie title. Now, if we take a look in our dropdown, the options all have values of the titles. But if we come in here and pick one of those, look what we get. Price 9, seats 0. That is because we picked Citizen Kane. If we pick The Godfather, we see the price is 8 and there's still no seats in there. What we did is added in this value. We have to be very particular there because we have quotes. Why do we have quotes? Because we always have quotes on HTML attributes. So we put those quotes in and then we say, hey, template literal, also drop the movie title in there. Again, why do we need that? Because when we get the value out from the event on the change of that element, we need to find it based off of the movie title alone, not the parenthesis $, and the price included in there. So what we can do is we add that value in, and now when we get the selected movie, we see it is only The Godfather. Because of that, we can take The Godfather, go up to our movie's object, and get out only The Godfather's movie data. So, what should you have in your console right now? You should be able to pick any of the movies from the dropdown and see the object that has the price and the array of seats, which is empty. There's nothing in it yet. Anyone not have that? If you don't,
My
The-
movie disappeared, but I'm trying to debug it myself. So
want to share a screen? Group debug? So as much as it pains us to say it, error messages are our friends because they're trying to give us a hint. In this case, you don't have any error messages, so I take all of those words back.
I don't know where my movie options went.
It's D right there. This movie title is missing again.
You are missing your closing tag. And then we also want the movie title to be here because we want the title to be in what gets displayed to the user, but we also want it in the value.
Okay, well, thank you.
And now we get that, and we also get the price out of 10, which matches our movie that we selected. So you know you're in good shape.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not having an issue with mine, right? Exactly sure why.
Sure, share screen.
I could find the button. There we go.
See people doing the same thing. That's why we group debug. That's why it's all worth it. What problem are you having?
I am not seeing. I don't think
Oh,
that
you have
anything is happening
parentheses.
on change.
You have parentheses around your value
Oh,
that you
You know
should
what,
not
that's-
have on 28.
is that it?
Hopefully. Nope. Okay, so we've got a different problem. The C in on change needs to be lowercase.
Ah. Gotcha. If that was it. Yeah. There we go.
Good to go.
No.
Asma, you're up.
I have parentheses around one parenthesis around like each pricing.
Okay. You need a closing parenthesis after the curly brace in movie data.price on your option line.
Is that the option plus equal line?
Yes.
Okay, that worked. Thank you.
Of course. Who else?
I got a question about this option thing. So I just don't quite understand it.
Okay.
And I was wondering if it's related to so like when I try to add an option tag in my HTML and I click enter, it auto populates with the value in parentheses that I can put in. So is that where this is getting the value from? So like if I was to make a value and within the option tag, would it be movie title? So JavaScript can refer to it. I'll share the screen to show you what I'm
Okay.
talking
Yeah.
about.
I feel the bones of a good question. I just don't quite understand it yet.
So if I try to do, oh, not like that, but option, like it automatically gives me a value. I guess this is
Yep.
a property. So let's say I did type in something there. Would it be movie title? That's how JavaScript is generating this.
So let me do it on mine just so I can annotate and see if I can answer it because I think I understand your question here. So we've got some trickle downness going on. What we have happening is, and at any time while I'm going through this, if you're like, nope, that's where I'm confused, like stop me. So movies is our object all the way up here, right? So let me do that and go. So we're using movies to fill in the movie title and the movie data. So that is coming from the movie title is coming from our object right here. And the movie data is coming from our object of this data right here. Now we are saying, hey, we're just working with strings here. JavaScript doesn't even know this is HTML yet. All it knows is it's a string. And so I'm going to make an option, which is like, okay, cool. It's probably an HTML element, but it's just a string to me right now. And we're going to add a property of value to it. And then the value of that is going to be, oh, hold up, $ curly braces. That means I don't actually want the letters MOVIETITLE to show up there. I want the actual movie title coming from our for loop right here. So what it's going to do is drop in the Godfather right here. Then it goes, all right, closing arrow, whatever. All right, drop my movie title back in again from up here, and then go up to the movie data and get out the price, which is going to flow from right here. So what shows up is we add all of those options together for each time this for loop runs, then take all of those options that we have generated right here and set it into the inner HTML of the movie dropdown, which we get by going to the HTML document and shoving it into the element with an ID of movie selection. That means that what we generated here, this whole option value string that we now do 3 times because of this for loop, is going to show up inside the inner HTML of the movie dropdown. And we know that because if we look in this dropdown, we can see the option with the value, which is just the title without the movie price, and then what displays to the user when they actually open the dropdown of The Godfather. So to take this a step further, could I theoretically disable all of this? So we go back to our example movies, and could I put in my HTML, my option with the value of Godfather? Yes. Because
Yes.
we just dynamically generated this, you will notice that if I pick an example movie, it's like undefined. It's like example movie, oh, that is, I can't find that in your movies. But if I pick The Godfather, I get the price and the array.
Okay.
So what
I
we are
understand.
doing is dynamically generating these options. Now you may say, well, Max, that's dumb. Why did we have to do that? I could have just put those 3 movies in there and I would have been good to go. Well, the benefit of doing it this way, because we're generating those options, what happens if I add a new movie?
Then it would just automatically populate in the dropdown.
As long as I set it up with the right data structure, when I come over here and re-enable my inner HTML to get set with my dynamic options, oh,
You forgot the quotes.
don't need the quotes because it doesn't have a space in the object's name. But thank you. Now, when I open my dropdown, Rugrats is just there.
Wow.
Why? Because our for loop is dynamically detecting that there's a new entry in that object. And so it is still generating out the new option that we added to that.
Thank you for breaking it down. It really did make it a lot clearer.
So,
Yeah, because I was definitely like, WTF is going on here? Like, I'm not understanding none of what he just said. But yeah, I really do appreciate you breaking it down with them little arrows. So it get put in my brain.
and some people see it's like a really polarizing thing. Some people see those lines and they're like, I'm going to go cross-eyed. I hate it when he does this. And other people are like, that was it. That made it click. So it's just different strokes for different folks. Yeah, we don't need, whenever we make an object, the same reason why don't we need quotes around price or seats, because these are just objects. We don't need those quotes because they don't have a space in the title. But if they do have a space in the title, like if we said something like price of movie, right? JavaScript gets really mad here. We are allowed to have spaces in our objects keys, but we do have to put them in quotes. So this actually would work. But whenever we can, we would camel case the keys. So it would be preferred to do price of movie this way. But sometimes you just can't get around, hey, all of these movies have quotes in them. It's a string. I should be allowed to use spaces. You are, as long as you include the quotes. But if there is no space, Prettier is kind of like well, those quotes aren't necessary for naming the key in that object, so it strips them out. We cannot do that over here, though. So if we said something like all, it would get really mad and be like, all is not defined. So we can only skip the quotes if if we're in the key, the values still need the quote, so it knows that it's a string data type. The only reason that it can do that is by default, all object keys are strings, so it just detects that's kind of redundant syntax. Okay. We're making progress. Any questions? All right. This is probably the most complicated part of the project. So we're going to do this in little snippets, and then we will go back through with 15 minutes left in class and number all of this out for review. So I don't want you guys to think that I am skipping that step. So we've got a problem here, because we're being really good about our data living in our JavaScript, right? We've got the price information up here. We've even set it up so if Planet of the Apes suddenly gets really expensive, when we come over here, it auto updates. Why is it auto updating? Because we were dynamic with the loop here. We pulled all of the data instead of hard coding it, instead of putting that all in options. We said, hey, anything that we update here will automatically update whenever this for loop runs. That's really cool. But we run into a problem here of our seats are chilling over here. And I'm like, well, I'm not really keeping track of all of those seats. Where do I want to be keeping track of those seats? I want to be keeping track of them in my movies object. And so now we run into an interesting spot where I'm like, I need to generate all of those seats for all of the movies. And then once they're generated, I need to update that seat data in my HTML. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go down to the bottom of our code, and we're going to say for the const movie of movies. For each movie, store that in movie so that and then loop over each one of them. Now that I am doing that, sorry, I'm just, okay. What I would like to do is generate 8 rows of seats and 8 columns of seats for each row for each movie. Whoa, it's a lot there. So let's break that down a little bit. I'm going to say for let row iterator. And we're going to a classic for loop here. Nothing fancy, no for ofs. We got to tell that for loop 3 conditions. What does the loop start at? It starts at 0. How many times do we want this loop to run if something is true? We want that to run while the iterator is less than 8. Because we want 8 rows. What do we want to increment the iterator by every time the row runs another time of the loop? We want to increment the row iterator by 1. So we say plus plus. Now, let's just see if this is working. Console log the row iterator. We save, we come over, we get movies is not iterable. And I'm like, what do you mean it's not iterable? We just iterated over it. We just looped over it up here. Oh, wait, what do we do up there? we ran into a problem that we can't loop over an object. An object's like their keys, their values here. Which one do you want? And I'm like, well, I want to loop over each one of the movies, but I don't really care about the title of the movie. All I care about is the movie data itself. I need to get into those seats in order to be able to update that. So what did I just say I cared about? Not the key of the object. I care about the value so that I can get into the seats. So that's exactly what I'm going to target. I'm going to come down here, and instead of looping over all of the movies where it's like it's an object, I don't know how to loop over an object, we're going to say object.values. Object.values is now going to give me access to the movie data. And now I can prove that because I can console log the movie data and see price 11, price 10, price 9. So this is the line to check. We want movie data as the const, and then object.values movies. Again, why do we need that object.values? Because looping over objects is really hard to do. Instead, what we want to do is loop over just the values of that object. That comes back as an array. And because it is an array, we can loop over that and get each one of the movie's data. So in our console, we should have the movie data for each one of the movies, and then 0 through 7. And it's shown up a bunch of times. We'll talk about that in a second, and I'll let you catch up on this one. Yeah.
I am not getting anywhere. I'm getting a stop on cannot declare a let variable twice.
Well, let's let you screen share. Is probably in your line 45. So 45 semicolons instead of commas on 45.
Oh,
Okay, and then your 43, change movie to movie data. And you're good to go.
all right. Thank you.
Of course. Anyone else need help or need another minute? Okay, yeah, so let's talk
had a
through this.
question.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry. Above with our function that said for movie title and movie data object entries, we use entries because we wanted to refer to the key.
Because we wanted both. We wanted the
Oh,
key
the whole
and the
thing.
value. But
So the
in
object.
this one, it's a really good question. Right here, we use entries because we wanted the key, the movie title, and the value that was in that key. So we said movie data. We could have actually done object.entries down here and still gotten access to the movie title and the movie data. But in this case, we don't actually care what movie title we're on. All we care about is getting access to the seats so that we can update them. So in this case, instead of using entries and getting both, we instead use just the dot values. And now you'll notice we only get the movie data compared to up here where we get both the title and the data.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course, great question. Okay, so let's talk about this for loop one more time because we haven't done a ton of for loops outside of for ups. A for loop needs 3 pieces of information to run. It needs to know where the for loop is starting. It needs to know what if this for loop should continue to run, and it needs to know how we're going to change the iterator after every time this loop runs. So the first thing that happens here is it goes row iterator is 0. Great. What do you want me to do? I want you to log out whatever row iterator is. So it does, and it logs out 0. Then it hits this curly brace and it goes, okay, what should I do at the end of this loop? I need to add 1 to row iterator. Now row iterator is 1. Is 1 less than 8? Yes, it is. So I'm going to go log that out again. I'm going to log out 1. And so we get 1. And it goes and hits the curly brace, goes, okay, I'm done with this time of the loop. What do you want me to do? Add 1 to row iterator. Row iterator now becomes 2. We go all the way up until 7. 7 is less than 8. So it logs out 7, hits this final curly brace and goes, now what would you like me to do? Row iterator becomes 8. 8 is not less than 8. 8 is less than or equal to 8. So 8 is not less than 8. So it is done with the loop here. So it goes, all right, I'm finished with this for loop. However, I now need to hit this for loop. Oh crap, there is now another movie in the movie data. So we run this for loop all over again. That means that because we now have 4 movies up here, and this for loop is running 8 times, this console log is actually running 32 times. Tell me I just did that right 4 times. Yes, 32. I know my times table still. Okay, so why is that? Because we can actually see that the first movie, here's the all 8 rows that we care about, and it happens again and again and again for each 4 of the movies. So the for loop, this for loop is actually running 8 times all 4 movies to run all 32 times. How does it know that? Because it's inside this curly brace for this movie right here. Questions?
Isn't this what's the term?
A
Recur-
nested for loop?
Oh, yeah. No. I was thinking of like this is like another way of
This is not recursion.
Okay.
Recursion is when a function calls itself, which does cause a loop. So recursion is another type of loop, but it's a very specific thing where the function has to call itself. Which is, I could write this recursively, but if you think this is hard, wait until you see the recursive solution for it. But yes, you could solve this using recursion. Just like you could solve this with a while loop. There, as we're seeing, there are lots of different ways of solving this. But this is believe it or not, the easiest way. Okay, we need to do one deeper dive. We need to do one more level of inception. We need to go into the dreaming mind one last level, because we not only need to do this for each movie, and we not only need to do this for all 8 rows, we also need to do this for the 8 columns of seats. So we need to write one more for loop that says for let call iterator equal 0. And while the call iterator is less than 8, call iterator plus plus. And what do we want to do for that? We are going to we need to keep track of all of these seats, right? So what we're going to do is inside of our row iterator, we are going to say, hey, start the row out as an empty array. Then for each one of the columns, go to the row and push in. Push is a function on an array that says add to the end of that an empty object. Don't worry too much about why it's an empty object, because we need to keep track of whether or not that seat is occupied and whether or not that seat is selected. Because there are two pieces of information about the seat, we want to keep track of that as an object. Then, once we are done looping over every column, once we have 8 of those seats pushed into the row, go into the movie data, which is coming from up here, and find the seats and push in our row of all of the seats that we generated. Don't worry, this is the last thing we're doing tonight, and then we're going to comment the crap out of all of this. In order to know if this is working, we need the last line of code that we are writing tonight, and then we are done. We're going to come down at the very end of our for loop, and we are going to console log out all the movies. Be very careful on your for loops here. If it helps to add comments, you can add comments. This is the start of for loop for each movie. This is the start of for loop for each row. And this is the start of for loop for each column. End of for loop for each column. End of for loop for each row. End of for loop for each movie. Be very careful on your curly braces here. This let row needs to be inside the row iterator, but outside the column iterator. Why? Because every time we start a new row, we need an empty array to keep track. We need an empty list to be able to put all of the columns of seats in. Why is this row.push inside the call iterator? Because we want a new seat for each column that we're going across. Why is movie seats.push row outside of this for loop? Because we're saying once we have generated all 8 columns, take the list of all of the columns, all of the seats that we have made, and store it in the seats of the movie data. Well, where's the movie data coming from? That's coming from the values of our movie. So in order to test and see if all of this is working, when we come over, we've got this final console log on line 57. And if we look at our 57, that's our console log movies. If we pop that open, you can now see all of our movies have an array of seats. But if we open that array of seats, we see what looks to be a grid. When we look at all of those seats, we can see 8 rows of seats, 0 through 7, 0 index, but we can also see the object of all of those seats inside the columns inside of the rows. What we don't see, and where we will start tomorrow, is how do we connect this data to make it show in the seats up here. So do not panic if you don't see all 64 seats showing up in your HTML, but you should be able to open up a movie and open up the seats array and see 8 arrays with 8 objects inside those arrays. We will go back through and comment all of this, but I want to give you 2 minutes to make sure that you can see in the console your array of seats.
Does the seat array need to be 8, or
No, you can do more if you want.
oh, because mine is 64.
So check to make sure that your movie data.seats.push row is outside of the col iterator, but inside the row iterator. If you used 8 on both for loops, you should not have 64. So while you're debugging that, this row.push, we've made it all the way down to the bottom level, right? And we're like, all right, we've looped over all the movies. We're making all of these rows. We're making all of these columns. Now what are we trying to do? Well, the seat that we're actually making here is going to keep track of 2 different pieces of information. It's going to keep track of whether or not someone else bought it, and it's also going to keep track of whether or not we clicked on it. So because we are keeping track of 2 pieces of information there, we are eventually going to use this object to keep track of selected and occupied. But until we do that, we kind of just need a placeholder. So we just make it an empty object to say, hey, we are going to keep track of a group of information about this eventually. What we are doing is we're pushing that empty placeholder into the row. The row is an empty array. And once we have done that for all 8 columns of seats, we then take that row, which we pushed all 8 seats into, and we push that into the seats of the movie data. Well, where's that coming from? That's coming from our for loop, which means that we are actually filling up these arrays right here with all of our rows. What is in all of our rows? All of our columns. What are our columns? A bunch of empty objects for now. That answer your question?
I think so.
Okay. Terry, you need help?
I'm gonna try to figure out.
Okay. Did a lot. The good news is we are going to go through and document all of this. And then tomorrow, we're going to start with a review on all of this, right? This is a lot of code. But hopefully you're starting to go for loops. We've seen those before. Maybe we haven't nested them, but for loops I kind of got. All right, object.values and object.entries. We haven't seen those before. They kind of make sense, right? I'm trying to get each one of these values. That's an entry. Or, oh, I'm trying to get just the value and not the key. That's going to be .values. So we're going to run through this from the top to the bottom in our JavaScript. So we start, number 1, log out link, linked, so we know HTML is connected to JS. Number 2, initialize a object with keys, with keys are movie titles, and values as a nested object that has 2 keys, price and seats, with values of numbers and an empty array. Objects can have an unlimited number of keys. The keys always need to be strings. If the strings have spaces in them, they need to be in quotes. Values can be any data type, which means we can have nested objects in other objects. We can have arrays in objects, which is what we have right here. we can have objects that have objects that have arrays. We can also do that. So we're setting up our data structure here. Why didn't we use an array for the list of all of our movies? Because how we wanted to access that data was by the name, the title of the movie, not necessarily the number of the movie in the list. So we used an object there. Well, then why did we use an array for our seats? Because we do want to access the seats by a number. We want to say, hey, second row, third seat in, what seat is that? So we set up these arrays as empty. So we have a place to store the seats once we generate them. Okay. We now go through and we say, take this out because that was kind of a placeholder, right? Of like, let's just remember the task that we're doing.
I got it.
Okay, cool. Okay, number 3, get the movie selection select from the HTML using the document object model. We reach into our HTML, we pull out our select, log our select to make sure we got it. Then number 5, log out the key value pairs using object.entries function built into JS, so we can see the structure of the data before we loop over it. Debug question, Terry, or question about the comments so far?
Oh, no, it was more of like what I did. What I did was I put the for leg call iterator. I put it there like twice, and it like nested inside of itself.
Gotcha.
And yeah, it was. I didn't realize I put it twice until I had to read. I'm like, oh, I put it there twice though.
That'll do it. Okay. Number 6. And anyone at any point, if you're reading that line and you're like, don't fucking know what that means, interrupt me, ask questions. Number 6, create new variable called options that starts as a string with an empty option element. Now, loop over each movie in the movies object, and using the object.entries function, get access to both the key of the object, movie title, and also the movie data, another object that has both price and seats. Number 8, log out both the movie title and the price to make sure our loop is running over each movie, and we can confirm we have access to the data we care about. Number 9, add onto the current value of options so the loop doesn't overwrite previous runs, previous iterations of it. Using a template literal, create a string with a value of the movie title as an HTML attribute. So we can know the movie that gets selected without the price information. In the inner HTML of the option element, use the movie title and the price displayed in parentheses to display to the user. Okay, why do we need this value tag here? Because we want to know only the movie title that they selected. We don't care about the price. We still want to show the price to the user, but when they click on that, we go, no, no, no. All we care about is the movie title that they clicked on. We don't care about the movie title and the price. And so what we do is we use the movie title twice because we still want to display it to the end user, but we want the computer to keep track of the value that they selected, not the value and the price. Terry.
But how would you know when to use the dollar the dollar things or not? Like I mean like in like real world like a real world situation, like how would you know when to like use it or not?
Yeah, so right here. We get movie title shown 4 times. Like, well, we don't want the word movie title to show up. What do we want to show up there? We want the value of movie title that we already did all of the work to get in the loop. So we know when we want to use $ curly braces. As the same time, we know we don't want to put movie title in quotes here. If we put movie title in quotes, it would be like, it's just another string. Put the letters MOVIE in there. But we don't want the letters MOVIE to show up. We actually want the value of that variable. So whenever we want the value of the variable to show up, that's when we put it in the $ curly braces. And now we get the title showing up instead. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah, it does. I'm just trying to see like is it easier to do it this way rather than the string cognition?
Well, if you look at the this is missing. So the problem with string concatenation is when you want to use quotes inside of the string, you now need to do single quotes and then double quotes to end the string, and then the movie title in here. So now this line has gotten so complicated, it's wrapped onto multiple lines. And we're like, all right, we're keeping track of the quote here, right? Because the value needs to have the quote. And then we need to also put in the movie title. And then we need to make sure that this single quote matches this single quote right here. And we also need to close the tag because then we need to put the movie title back in. So now, if you're looking at this line of code compared to this line of code, which one is easier to understand?
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's why we get into this whole, and React is going to avoid this in another way. It's going to basically make all of our code a template literal, which makes it easier for us to drop variables in. But this gets really messy, right? Because if we miss one of those closing quotes, Now, when we look at the options, look at what's happening here, right? We get all of this weird value. It's got a double quote, but it's got no closing quote on it. And that's really easy to miss just that one quote. And so that's why we use template literals, because oftentimes there are multiple variables that we want to inject into our code. We are going to stop after this inner HTML. So we're going to say number 10, using all the options we generated from number 9, set that into the select tag from all the way up here on number 3. And one more, run 8 and 9 for each one of the movies, thanks to the for loop from number 7. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. We will start with continuing our commenting tomorrow. We'll go through the on change and we'll go through all of the work that we did to get the seats working. And afterwards, we will update our on change to display the seats that we generated with this for loop here. So, little homework assignment for you. I'm not going to make you turn anything in. I'm not going to check you on it, but read through between now and tomorrow night's class. Don't worry about the on change. Don't worry about the for loop. We haven't reviewed it yet. You don't need to worry about it. But I want you to review 1 through 10 tonight. Whether it's 5 minutes before class tomorrow, whether it's the end of class right now, read through 1 through 10 and see if you have any questions about it. That's where we'll start tomorrow. Then we'll finish commenting out the rest of this code, and then we will get our loop to actually generate out the HTML for all of our seats. And then it really gets fun. We can get into user interactivity of them clicking on the seats and all of that good stuff. I will stick around for a couple minutes in case you guys have any questions. I'm officially a minute over, so have a great night, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Don't forget to review 1 through 10's comments before class tomorrow and see if you have any questions.
So a React gonna have like both HTML and JavaScript like all together, like you can write it all in one thing.
One file. Yep.
Oh man. Oh, that sounds nice. Okay, so how would that even like work?
Wait until we get there.
Yeah. Um
The answer is the oversimplified answer to that is just syntax.
Oh, so if we might use it as like own syntax.
It uses
Okay, gotcha.
JSX. Yep.
Gotcha.
So this is what it looks like. And so you'll see down here, there's a return function, which we've seen from JavaScript. And there are things like form tags that we've seen before. But then we have these curly braces, and these curly braces kind of work like the template literal. They say, hold up, no more HTML. You want some JavaScript in here. And so the JavaScript, like on change text inputted, is actually linking to a function up here called text inputted. So you can see we still have events, we still have event target value, all of that's still the same. But what React lets you do is in one big function, it allows you to have all of the functions it takes to make this, what we call a component, work. And then at the bottom of the component, it returns out some HTML that we can drop our JavaScript into, like video.movie is coming from all the way up here, our video, which is coming from a variable. So it is a React the way that we can intermix our HTML and JavaScript. And then in our HTML, we're able to do things like curly braces. That's the JSX syntax, which goes off HTML onto JavaScript syntax, where we can use things like dot notations for our objects and all kinds of stuff in there. So that's where we're headed into React.
Okay, it definitely seems a lot easier to do it like that, but I guess we have to wait and see for that.
Well,
Um,
it's important. A lot of people go, why don't we just go right into React? Like, why do we have to learn HTML and JavaScript first? And part of the answer is like, you don't really understand nested HTML tags unless you learn HTML straight up first, right? It's harder to learn JavaScript syntax. Or if you go right into React, you're like, well, what's JavaScript here and what's HTML here? Now you're trying to learn both syntaxes at the same time. That gets a little messy. And at the end of this, you may get a job and they go, well, we only build HTML websites. We don't use React. And now you're like, oh, well, I don't know what's the React feature and what's straight up HTML. So that's the reason we build up to that, instead of dropping you like right into the deep end with React.
and you can also write CSS in React, right? Or is it?
Yes.
Okay, so it's just literally just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript all in one.
Yeah, the
Gotcha.
weird thing is the way you write CSS in React is as a JavaScript object. So the CSS property becomes the key of the object, except it's camel cased. And then the value, because it's a JavaScript object, you can do dynamic values, you can do string concatenation, you can do all kinds of stuff to get really fancy in your CSS.
Okay, okay. Well, I think that's it. Like for like questions and stuff. Well,
Cool.
until I like review like what we just learned. So.
Oh, and I will push that code up to GitHub right now before I forget.
Oh yeah, because I'm gonna definitely get that on my Windows computer and try to work like just work back and forth with it. So and with that, I hope you have a good night, Max.
Thank you. You too.